Hello and welcome back to Beyond English. This week we are starting on a new series that takes a look at the 15 poems from AQA's Power and Conflict cluster of poetry. We're going to start this week by taking a look at Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. In this video, find out why he was expelled from university, discover the truth about why he was throwing shade at the monarchy when he wrote the poem, and stay tuned to discover the gruesome tale about where his wife kept his heart after he died. Now, Ozymandias is a poem that was written in sonnet form by the author Percy Bysshe Shelley. You may have heard of sonnets through your study of other poets like Shakespeare or William Wordsworth, but Shakespeare is probably the most famous of the poets that you know that wrote in the sonnet form. The poem was written as part of a friendly competition with Percy's friend Horace Smith after they heard the news that the British Museum had acquired the remains of a statue of the pharaoh Ramesses II. So the poem was written in 1817 and it was published in newspapers. Shelley was a Romantic poet. Now, if you can get your head around the Romantic poets and this movement and why it was important to European social change, then you'll be at a really good start to get to grips with the context of many of the Power and Conflict poems. Romanticism was a movement of poetry started in the late 1700s by the aforementioned William Wordsworth and people like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and their other peers. They believed in the importance of the natural world and they aimed to show the beauty and supremacy of nature in the way that they wrote, the things that they wrote about, and the language that they used in their poetry. However, people like Shelley were a second-generation Romantic poet. And this was different from the first generation because it decided to take a stand and not look at the power of nature, the beauty of nature, or use some of the flowery language that the fans of this sort of poetry have become acquainted with. So people like Shelley decided that the previous form of the first generation poets had grown old and that they needed to set themselves apart to stand out and appeal to this new kind of audience. So they looked to things like foreign lands and foreign antiquities and to form the basis of their works. And they decided, as mentioned, to steer away from the flowery language previously used and adopt this colloquial, chatty style of language that's present within Ozymandias. Shelley was a renegade of his times. He was an atheist, which means that he didn't believe in God, and he was a pacifist and he was deeply political. And this caused quite the uproar throughout his life. He attended Eton and Oxford College as a young student, but he decided in his actions of being a renegade and standing out from everybody else that he was going to write a paper that questioned the existence of God. And this didn't go down very well with the colleges, so he was actually expelled for writing this paper. But this didn't deter him from being such a renegade or being a holder of revolutionary ideals, because the rest of his life continued to be fraught with scandal and things that the general public at the time would have been completely shocked by. After leaving his first wife, who later committed suicide, he married his lover, Mary Godwin. Now, the name Mary Godwin isn't going to mean a lot to you, but if I tell you that with her married name, Mary Shelley, she was the author of Frankenstein, then that will probably mean a lot more to you. He spent most of his adult life living outside of Britain and spent most of that time in Italy. This was in stark contrast to his upbringing in a conservative, wealthy home in Sussex. You may be asking why you need to know this information, but this insight into his rebelliousness gives us a way into understanding his anti-authority view on the world and could be the reason why he decided to write poetry about failed kingdoms. Going back to his life at this time, a month short of his 30th birthday, he was in Italy on a boating trip with his friends. And then they got caught in a violent storm. And it was actually this that was the cause of his death when his boat actually came into some difficulty and sank. His body was actually retrieved by some of his literary friends because Mary wasn't there at the time. And they decided that the easiest thing to do was cremate it. So they built a pyre and burnt the body up on it. However, when they returned to retrieve the ashes to return to his wife, Mary Shelley, they discovered, strangely, that his heart hadn't burned upon the pyre. So they collected it and returned it to Mary, who made the very strange decision to keep it in her desk for many years after that. Like many famous authors and poets, Shelley wasn't famous during his time, probably because people didn't want to be associated with his ideas and his revolutionary viewpoint on the world. And he only found fame posthumously after he died. And this was because of his sharp stance on religion and politics, and people didn't want to be linked to that or linked to him in any way. Now let's take a look at some of the context of the poem and the importance of the title. So we know that it was written in 1817, and this was during the reign of the famous tyrannical ruler, King George III. Despite him being the longest ruler out of any of his predecessors, he wasn't particularly well thought of, and he wasn't held in any sort of public favour, and because of his involvement in many of the military conflicts. Shelley and many of the people at the time felt that this government was oppressive and things needed to change. And like Shelley, many people believed that there needed to be a revolution and something needed to change. He was very strong in his beliefs, but he was not willing to openly and brazenly criticise the king. So in writing Ozymandias, he was able to make a thinly veiled attack at the monarchy and it not be so obvious or so open, so he wouldn't have to face any of the consequences for doing that. As we know, Ramesses II is the subject of the poem, and he was an Egyptian pharaoh, which is a king from 1279 to 1213 BC. The name Ozymandias was the Greek name given to the ruler, Ozy deriving from the Greek word ozium, meaning to breathe, and mandius deriving from the Greek mandate, meaning to rule. Very much like King George III, he was a tyrannical ruler and he led numerous battles, and this was ostensibly to protect Egypt's borders, but also to extend its territory. And he did this through many ruthless military attacks. It is actually believed that he led Egypt during the biblical exodus of Moses. While Ramesses II most likely commissioned the statue in the belief that it would be a lasting reminder of his power and status, we know the irony of the poem is that the cruel and harsh desert land and this unforgivable landscape actually consumed the statue, and the statue never outlasted the effects of nature. So it is actually the desert landscape and the harshness and cruelty of nature that is the lasting image within the poem. And this shows that nature conquers all, as per the belief of both the first and second generation romantics. We're going to leave that there for this week. But if you have found this content useful and would like a written form of it, please access that on our website through the link in the description below. Thanks for watching, and join us next time where we'll be discussing the form and structure of the poem. Bye.